Cal RANSOME slept in the tack room of a ranch that spelled his own name over the gate. He ate his supper standing up, by the door, where the draft came in cold. The men who ate his father's beef at the long table never once looked his way. And when the foreman told him drifters didn't get a bunk, Cal did not argue. He picked up his plate. He went and stood by the door. That was the first night. His name was Hollis Deane. Foreman turned owner, or so he called himself. He stood in the middle of the bunkhouse with 11 hands watching, and he said it loud so the rafters carried it. Drifters don't get a bunk. And they sure don't get a name. You'll ride out when the snow comes, if you last that long. The hands laughed the way men laugh when the boss laughs first. Cal chewed his beans. He said nothing at all. Up on the porch of the main house, the new schoolteacher watched through the window. Adeline Foss. She'd come to Alder Creek 3 weeks back with a trunk of books and a good coat. She saw the ragged man by the door. She saw them laugh. And when the foreman turned his back, she wrapped half her own supper in a cloth and carried it out to him without a word. Cal took it. He nodded once. And in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, something heavy caught the lamplight, a ring with a brand cut into it. He shut the flap before anyone could see. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we ride on, if a story about a man judged by his rags means something to you, take a second and subscribe, so you don't miss the turn. And do me one thing, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this ride travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Cal came into Alder Creek on a borrowed-looking horse with a good deep chest. In the last week of September 1878, 4 years on the drift had worn him down to rope and leather. His coat was gray with dust. His boots had been resoled twice by his own hand. He wore a hat pulled low, and a beard he hadn't meant to grow, and under all of it a face nobody in that valley had seen in a long, long time. The town sat in a fold of the high-grass country, under mountains already gone white at the tops. One street. A church, a mercantile, a livery, a saloon that called itself a hotel, a schoolhouse at the end of the lane, new painted. Cal rode past all of it slow. He looked at the mountains a while. Then he turned his horse up the long wagon road that ran north out of town, toward the big outfit that took up the whole East Range. He knew the road. He had ridden it as a boy. He had ridden it the day he left, and he had told himself he would never ride it back. But here he was. At the top of the last rise the gate stood as it always had. 2 posts, a crossbeam, and burned deep into the wood in letters a foot high, Ransom. His father had heated the iron and set those letters himself, the summer Cal turned 10. Cal sat his horse under that gate for a long minute. He did not touch it. Then he rode through, the way any hired man rides through, hat down, eyes down, asking for work. Deane came out onto the porch of the main house. He was a heavy, well-fed man of near 50, in a clean shirt and a good vest, with a watch chain that caught the sun. He looked Cal over the way a man looks over a horse he doesn't mean to pay full price for. "Looking for work," Cal said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't used it much. "Can you rope?" "I can." "Break a horse?" "I can do that too." Deane spat off the edge of the porch. "We're short 2 hands since the summer. Pays $1 a day, and you don't eat till the paying men eat. You sleep in the tack room. You give me lip. You ride out that gate the same hour. That suit a man like you?" "It suits," Cal said. And that was how the elder son of Josiah RANSOME hired on at his own father's ranch, for $1 a day. And no one knew him. They put him to the worst of it, the way they do a new man they don't respect. Mucking the corrals, mending the wire on the far fences where the wind never stopped, hauling water. He did it all without a word, and he did it well, and that was the first thing that started to bother the older hands. Not that he was slow, but that he was good, and quiet about it, and it made the loud ones feel loud. There was an old dog on that ranch. a blue heeler gone gray around the muzzle, half blind, that mostly lay in the sun by the barn and growled at anyone who came near. His name was Blue. He'd been a pup the year Cal left. The first evening Cal walked past him, the old dog lifted his head. He got up, stiff in the hips, and he followed Cal across the yard and lay down again where Cal was working, and the hands looked at each other, because Blue didn't do that for anybody, not even Deane. "Dog's gone soft," one of them said. Cal scratched the old dog behind the ear and said nothing. The bunkhouse was warm and full of talk in the evenings, and Cal was not in it. He took his plate from the cook and ate standing by the door of the main house, or out on the step, and then he walked back across the dark yard to the tack room. It smelled of saddle soap and horse and old leather. He unrolled his blankets on the bench, and every night, before he slept, he took the oilcloth bundle out of his saddlebag and unwound it, and looked at the ring in the low light. It was a man's signet, heavy silver gone dark. On the face of it, cut deep, was the ranch brand, the same brand burned into the gate, into the hides of every cow on that range, into the wood over the door. His father's brand. His father's ring. Cal had taken it off the old man's hand himself, 4 years and 1,000 miles away, on a bad night on the Kansas plains, and he had carried it every mile since. He never wore it. He didn't put it on now. He wrapped it back in the oilcloth and hid it deep, and he lay down in the dark, and he listened to the wind come down off the mountains and worry at the boards. He'd meant to say who he was the first day. He'd meant to walk up on that porch and tell Deane the truth. But he'd stood under the gate, and something in him had gone quiet and careful. 4 years he'd been gone, presumed dead. His father dead too, they said in town, grieved himself into the grave after the boy was lost on the drive. And Deane running the whole thing now like he'd been born to it. Cal didn't know yet what had happened here while he was away. He only knew that a man who shows his hand too early gets nothing but run off. So, he kept it in the oilcloth. He watched. He waited. And he told himself it was patience and not fear, though some nights he wasn't sure which one it was. In town, the story of the new drifter went around the way stories do. Adeline heard it at the boarding house where she took her meals. Mrs. Pell, who ran the place, told it over the potatoes. Deane took on some saddle tramp up at the RANSOME place. Ragged fella. Won't last past the first snow, I'd wager. They never do. And Adeline, who was new enough to the country to still ask questions, said, "What happened to the RANSOMEs? A ranch that size, and no family on it?" The table went a little quiet. Then Mrs. Pell told her, the short version, the town version. Old Josiah Ransome built the outfit up from nothing. Had one boy, Caleb, wild and hard-headed, always crosswise with the father. The boy took a herd up the trail to Kansas 4 years back and never came home, killed on the drive, they said, or drowned, or just gone the way young men go. It broke the old man. He wasted away inside the year. And Hollis Deane, who'd been foreman 20 years, held the whole thing together when it might have fallen apart, and now ran it as his own. "Sad business," Mrs. Pell said. "But that Deane, he's steady. Kept all those men in work. You could do worse than a steady man in this country." Adeline said she supposed you could, but she was thinking about the ragged man on the step, eating by the door, and about the way the foreman's men had laughed. And she found she did not think of Hollis Deane as a steady man. She thought of him as a loud one. She kept that to herself. A schoolteacher 3 weeks in a town learns to keep things to herself. The next she saw of the drifter was 2 days later, in town, and it changed the shape of her thinking. There was a boy in Alder Creek named Toms. 9 years old, motherless, the son of a man who worked the livery and drank up most of what he earned. The boy was in Adeline's schoolroom when he came at all, which wasn't often, and he was quick and sad and always in trouble. That afternoon he was sitting in the dust behind the mercantile, crying the quiet, furious way a proud child cries, because some bigger boys had broken the toy horse he'd carved out of a pine knot. And the drifter was there, down on one knee in the dirt in his gray coat. He had the broken pieces in his big scarred hands, and he was turning them over, and he was talking low to the boy. Adeline stopped at the corner and watched, because she couldn't help it. "See here," Cal was saying. "You cut against the grain, it splits every time. Watch the grain. It does what you tell it." He took out a worn knife. He picked up a fresh chunk of soft pine off the woodpile. And right there, slow, he started a new horse for the boy. The legs, the arch of the neck, the set of the head, and the boy stopped crying and leaned in close to watch those hands work. Cal wasn't gentle in any soft way. He was patient. He showed the boy the cut, then gave him the knife and let him ruin the next one, and didn't scold him for it, just handed him another piece, and said, "Again." Adeline stood at the corner a long time. She thought about the word drifter. It didn't fit what she was looking at. Drifters didn't teach a stray boy to whittle in the dust behind a store with the patience of a man who had nowhere better in the world to be and had made his peace with it. She went on to the schoolhouse, but the picture stayed with her all evening. Out at the ranch, Deane had started to notice the same thing the older hands noticed, and he didn't like it. A quiet man who does his work well and asks for nothing is hard to break, and Deane was a man who needed to feel that he could break a thing if he chose. So he started in on Cal in the small ways a boss has. He docked his pay. Said Cal had left a gate open and lost him a steer, which wasn't true, and took 2 days' wages for it. Cal took the loss without a word, and that made Deane worse, not better. Then, on a cold, bright morning, Deane had them bring up the black horse. Every outfit has one. This one was a big black 3-year-old, mean as a snake, that had already thrown 2 men and cracked the arm of a third. Nobody would top him. Deane had him run into the round corral, and he leaned on the rail with his thumbs in his vest, and he called Cal over in front of the whole crew. "You said you could break a horse. Break that one." He smiled. He wanted the drifter thrown. He wanted him bloodied in the dirt in front of the men, to put him back in his place. Cal looked at the black a while. The horse was blowing, ears back, circling the rail. Cal climbed through and stood in the middle of the corral and did nothing at all. He didn't reach for the horse. He didn't chase it. He turned a little sideways and lowered his eyes and just breathed, and waited, and let the horse run. And the black ran, and slowed, and blew, and finally stopped and stood trembling and looked at this quiet man who wanted nothing from him. And Cal stepped up soft along the shoulder, talking so low none of them could hear the words, and he laid one scarred hand flat on the black's neck. The horse shuddered. And gentled. Just like that. He didn't ride him that morning. He didn't need to. He led that killer horse around the corral by a hand on the mane, and the crew went dead silent, and Deane's smile was gone. "Anybody can gentle a spoiled horse," Deane said, too loud into the quiet. "Don't mean nothing." But it meant something, and every man on that rail knew it, and the knowing made Deane's neck go red. He shoved off the rail and told Cal to get back to the fences, and Cal did, and the black watched him go over the top rail like a colt watches its mother. That night Deane told him he wasn't to come in the bunkhouse at all, not even to warm up by the stove. Tack room and the yard, that was all he'd have. The other hands didn't say much. 1 or 2 looked ashamed. But nobody crossed Deane, because Deane held their jobs, and jobs were thin in that country with winter coming, and winter was the other thing. Cal learned it standing by the door one evening, from the talk drifting out of the bunkhouse. 2 of the hands, low, not knowing he could hear. "You reckon it's true about the note?" "It's true. Cattlemen's Trust down in Denver. $4,200 against the range, and the old man let it ride, and it comes due first snow. Deane don't clear it, they foreclose, and he sells the whole outfit to the trust to cover it, and where's that leave us? Out in the cold, that's where. He'll clear it. Deane always lands soft. On our backs, he lands soft. $4,200, due by first snow, or the ranch is sold out from under all their jobs. Cal stood by the door with his cold plate and did not move. His father had never carried a note in his life. Josiah RANSOME hated debt the way some men hate snakes. If there was $4,200 against the range, it had come after the drive, after the sun was gone, after the old man went down. It had come while Deane held the reins. Cal chewed slow and kept his face still, and inside him something that had been sleeping for 4 years began, very quietly, to wake. He decided that night that he had to know 2 things: what had really happened to his father, and where the papers were, because his mother, God rest her, dead these 10 years, had been a careful woman and a faithful one, and there was one place in this whole country she had trusted with the things that mattered. The old mission chapel of San Rafael. Down the south road, an hour's ride, adobe and beam. Older than the town. Older than the ranch. His mother had gone there her whole life. She'd kept things there, letters, records, the family papers, with the old priest, because she didn't trust a wooden house that could burn. Cal had forgotten it. Almost, now he remembered it clear as morning. But he couldn't ride out there yet. Not with Deane watching a new man's every move. He'd have to wait for a night he wouldn't be missed. So, he waited. He worked. He watched. The waiting broke at the town social, the last Saturday before the weather turned. Alder Creek held its harvest social in the Grange Hall at the edge of town. Lanterns, a fiddle, long tables of food the women had cooked all week. The whole valley crowded in out of the cold. The ranch hands came into it, cleaned up as best they could, and Deane came in his good coat like a man who owned the county. Cal came because the cook needed help hauling in the beef the ranch had donated, and once the work was done, he stood back against the wall in the shadow, out of the light, hat in his hands, not meaning to be seen. Adeline was there. In a blue dress, with the school children swarming her, and half the men of the valley finding reasons to bring her cider. She saw Cal against the wall. She started across the room toward him. She told herself later she only meant to say good evening, to thank him for what he'd shown the boy Toms. She didn't get the chance. Deane got there first, and Deane had been drinking, and Deane had an audience, which for a man like Deane is the same as a loaded gun. "Well, look here," he said, loud, so the fiddle nearly stopped. The drifter come to the dance. Heads turned. The room quieted the way a room does when it smells cruelty coming and can't look away. "Boys, don't let him near the food till the decent folks eat. And somebody count the silver on the way out." A few men laughed. Not all, but enough. Cal said nothing. He looked at the floor. That silence, that refusal to be baited, it enraged Deane more than any answer could have. He stepped in close. He knocked the hat out of Cal's hands into the muck by the door, where the boots tracked in the mud. And he said the thing Adeline would remember the rest of her life. The thing that was truer than Deane could ever know. "You come in here wearing the dirt of the road, and you stand in a hall built by better men, and I'll tell you something, Drifter," he leaned in. "That name up on my gate, RANSOME, that name belongs to men who earned it. Not to trash that blows in off the trail and calls itself a hand. You'll never be worth the wood it's burned into." The whole room heard it. Nobody moved. Cal bent down. Slow, he picked his hat up out of the mud. He didn't wipe it. He didn't look at Deane. He straightened up and he stood there, holding his ruined hat, and he did not say one single word, and the not saying was somehow louder than anything Deane had roared. A muscle worked in his jaw. That was all. And then Adeline crossed the room. She crossed it in front of everybody, in her blue dress, her heels loud on the plank floor in the dead quiet. She walked right up to Cal. She held out her hand for the hat, and after a moment he gave it to her, not understanding. She took it to the water bucket by the door. She dipped her handkerchief. And she cleaned the mud off the brim. Careful, taking her time, in front of the foreman and the fiddle and the whole staring valley, and then she shaped it back and she handed it to Cal with both hands, the way you hand a man something that matters. "There," she said. Quiet, but not too quiet to be heard. Good as new. And then, to the room, cool as creek water, "I've never yet seen a name earned by mocking a man who won't stoop to answer you." You could have heard a pin drop. Deane's face went the color of raw beef. He opened his mouth and shut it. The fiddler, God bless him, struck up a tune to cover it, and the room came back to life in a rush of relief, and the moment passed. But it didn't pass for the three people at the center of it. Cal held his hat and looked at the schoolteacher like a man looking at something he hadn't believed was still made in this world. Adeline looked back at him, steady, and she wasn't thinking drifter anymore. She didn't know what she was thinking. But it wasn't that. And Deane watched the two of them, and filed it away, and began, in the cold engine of his mind, to hate the ragged man, not just as a nuisance now, but as a threat. Cal left the social early. He walked out into the cold, and he stood a minute in the dark with his cleaned hat in his hands, and he made up his mind. That night he saddled the deep-chested horse quiet, after the ranch was asleep, and he rode south under a thin moon to the mission chapel of San Rafael. It stood where it had always stood, low and pale against the dark hills, a cross black on the sky. There was a light in the little room behind it. Cal tied his horse and knocked, and after a while the door opened, and there stood Padre Anselmo, old now, stooped, a candle in his hand, his face all shadows. The old priest lifted the candle to see who called so late. He looked at the ragged man in the doorway, and he went still. The candle shook, just a little, and the light ran up the wall. "I'm looking for something," Cal said, careful, keeping his voice low the way he kept it always now. "Papers my mother kept here. Elena RANSOME. She trusted this place. I need to know what she left." The padre didn't answer at first. He stared at Cal's face, at the line of the jaw under the beard, at the eyes, at something in the set of the shoulders, and the color drained right out of his old cheeks until he was gray as the adobe. His lips moved. No sound came. He put one hand out and touched the doorframe like a man who needs to be sure the wall is real. "Madre de Dios," the old man whispered at last. "It cannot be." "You are. I'm a hired man asking after my mother's papers," Cal said, quick, low, with a warning in it. "That's all I am tonight, Padre. That's all I can be. Do you have them, or not?" The Padre looked at him a long moment more. Then something moved behind the old eyes, fear or hope or both, and he stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in," he breathed. "Come in, quickly, before you are seen. There is much you do not know. And God forgive me, there is much I should have told, and did not, because I was afraid." He crossed himself. "Come in," and shut the door. And Cal stepped into the candlelight, and the door closed behind him, and whatever the Padre knew, whatever had turned him gray at the sight of a drifter's face, the night kept it, for now. What passed between them in that small room, Cal carried back to the ranch before dawn, tight-jawed and silent, and it changed him. He came back harder, not louder, just harder, the way a blade is harder than the iron it was. He said even less than before, which the hands would not have thought possible. But he watched everything now, and he was waiting for something, And a man who is waiting for something is a dangerous man to underestimate, which is exactly what Deane went right on doing. Because Deane had troubles of his own, and they were closing in. First snow was coming. Every morning the white on the mountains crept a little lower, and $4,200 sat against the range like a stone, and the Cattlemen's Trust down in Denver was not a patient institution. Deane needed clear title. He needed to be able to prove, on paper, that the ranch was his, free and unencumbered by any living ransom, so that when the note came due, he could sell the whole outfit to the trust, cover the debt, and pocket what was left, which was a fortune. But you cannot sell what you cannot prove you own. And the truth was, Hollis Deane had never owned 1 acre of the RANSOME range. He had run it. That was all. So Hollis Deane produced a will. He brought it out 10 days after the social, at just the right moment, to just the right men. He called it Josiah RANSOME's last will and testament. It left the entire estate, land, stock, buildings, everything, to Hollis Deane, in gratitude for his faithful service. There being no living heir. It was written in a fair hand. It bore a signature that looked, to anyone who'd seen the old man's scrawl on a bill of sale, near enough to Josiah's own. And it was dated the 4th of March, of the year the old man died. He showed it in town at the Mercantile, and to the men at the ranch, and to anyone who'd look, wearing the sorrowful face of a loyal servant, reluctantly come into his reward. And the town believed it. Why wouldn't they? The boy was dead. The old man was dead. Somebody had to have the place, and Deane had held it together, hadn't he? Steady, Deane. The paper looked right. Nobody in Alder Creek had ever seen a forged will, and so nobody thought to see one now. Nobody but Cal. And Cal, standing by the door with his cold plate, while Deane read it aloud to the hands with wet eyes, saw the forgery whole and plain, because Cal knew one thing the whole valley did not. The 4th of March. That was the date on the paper. And on the 4th of March, the year his father died, Josiah RANSOME had not held a pen. Cal knew it the way you know your own name. The padre had told him, that night in the chapel, had shown him the mission's own record of it. In his careful hand, Josiah had taken to his bed by the middle of February, struck down, his right side gone, his hand curled useless on the quilt. He could not sign. He could not hold a spoon, let alone a pen, not in March, not ever again. He'd lingered near 2 months that way, and died in April without once being able to write his name. Half the old mission knew it. The padre had sat with him. The will was dated a day the dead man's hand was already stone. Cal said nothing. Of course he said nothing. A drifter who called a well-liked foreman a forger in front of the crew would be off the place before noon. And then, who'd stop Deane at all? So he ate his beans and he watched Deane fold the paper away, and he went on mending fence, and quietly, carefully, in the cold days that followed, he began to gather what he'd need. He rode down to San Rafael twice more by night. He and the old padre bent together over the mission registry by candlelight, turning the yellowed pages, and what they found there, Cal kept it wrapped tight, and told no one, and it put a light in his eyes that had not been there since he was a boy under that gate. And Adeline, in the schoolhouse in town, found her own small piece of the truth, and it undid her. It was a cold afternoon, the children gone home, the stove ticking. She was clearing out the old slates and readers that had come with the schoolhouse, boxes of them, dusty, left by teachers before her going back years. She was sorting the broken slates from the whole ones to see what could still be used. And she turned one over, an old one, the wooden frame worn smooth by small hands, and there, scratched into the corner of the frame with a nail by some child long ago, careful and proud the way a boy carves his name to say I was here, were the words, Caleb RANSOME. Adeline sat down on the bench with the slate in her lap. Caleb RANSOME. The dead son. the wild boy who'd gone up the trail and never come home. He'd sat in this room. He'd learned his letters at this very desk, maybe, and scratched his name in the corner of his slate the way boys do. She ran her thumb over the little grooves of it, and she thought, she couldn't help but think, of a ragged man on a knee in the dust, teaching a stray boy to cut with the grain, of scarred hands gentling a killer horse, of a man who stood in a hall and let himself be called trash rather than answer, holding his muddy hat, saying nothing, with a muscle working in his jaw. Of the way he'd looked at her when she cleaned it. She told herself it was foolishness. The son was dead. Everyone said so. A dead man doesn't come back to muck his own corrals for $1 a day. It was foolishness, and she was a grown woman and a schoolteacher, and she would not sit here spinning stories out of a scratched slate. But she did not throw the slate in the broken pile. She wrapped it in a cloth, careful, and she put it in her own trunk, and that night she lay awake a long time, and the word drifter would not sit right in her mouth anymore, not any way she turned it. She began to understand, in a way she had no words for yet, exactly who it was that ate his supper standing by the door. And the understanding frightened her, and it moved her, and she resolved to find a way to speak to him, alone, and simply ask. She never got the chance to ask it gentle. Because the weather broke first. It came on the last night of October, and it came the way the high country does it, with no mercy and no warning to speak of. All that day the sky had hung low and yellow-gray, and the wind smelled of iron, and the old-timers looked north and said nothing, which is the worst thing they can do. By dark, the first fat flakes were coming sideways, and then it wasn't flakes anymore. It was a wall, snow driven flat on a screaming wind, the temperature falling like a dropped stone. First snow. The deadline snow. And with it, up in the high pastures, came the rain and melt roar off the ridges that fed Alder Creek and turned that quiet stream, in a single black hour, into a brown flood tearing its banks. The trouble was the calves. The ranch had moved a bunch of late calves and their mothers down into the creek bottom pasture the week before, good grass, sheltered. And now the creek was coming up over the bottom in the dark, and those calves were the collateral. The living wealth the trust counted against the note, the difference between a herd worth saving and a foreclosure. And the trouble was the boy. Because Toms, motherless, half-wild Toms, who worshipped the quiet man that had taught him to whittle, had ridden out from town on a mule that afternoon to bring Cal a horse he'd carved him, and gotten caught by the storm, and was somewhere out there now in the dark and the rising water, and nobody knew it yet but the storm. Cal knew it when the mule came in riderless. He was in the yard when it stumbled up out of the white, saddle empty, eyes rolling, and he knew that mule, and he knew whose it was, and he was moving before he'd finished the thought. He threw his saddle on the deep-chested horse. Deane came out onto the porch bawling that no man was to risk stock in this, that the calves would have to take their chances, that he'd not lose a horse and rider for it, and Cal rode past him into the storm without a word, because there was a child in that water, and the calves were his father's calves, and the ranch was his ranch, and Hollis Deane's orders had stopped meaning one thing to Cal Ransom a long time ago. The creek bottom was a nightmare of black water and driving snow. Cal found the calves first, bunched and bawling on a shrinking hump of ground with the flood rising around them, their mothers churning in the shallows, and beyond them, out where the water ran fast and deep and mean, clinging to the fork of a half-drowned cottonwood with the current tearing at him, white-faced, too cold now even to scream, the boy. Cal did not stop to think about it. He turned the deep-chested horse into the flood. The water hit them like a live thing, cold enough to stop the heart, dragging, and the horse screamed and swam, and Cal leaned low along its neck and drove it on toward the black shape in the cottonwood, into the roar and the dark. With the snow coming down like the end of the world, and the boy's grip already failing on the drowned tree, the horse found the bottom and lost it, and found it again. Cal felt the cottonwood before he saw it, a hard black snag under his knee, and he got one arm around the fork of it and reached with the other into the water for the boy. Tom's was past holding on. His hands had gone to hooks, his eyes were open, and he was looking at Cal, but there was nobody home behind them, just cold. And Cal got a fist in the collar of the coat and hauled him up out of the current and against his chest. The boy weighed nothing. 4 years of drifting, and Cal had carried heavier saddles. But nothing had ever been harder to hold. "I've got you," Cal said, into the storm, where no one could hear it. "I've got you. Hang on to me now." The horse wheeled in the deep water and pointed its nose at the pale hump of ground where the calves stood, and it swam. Cal held the boy with one arm and the mane with the other, and let the horse do what the horse knew. Twice the current took them sideways. Twice the deep-chested horse fought back into it. Then there was gravel under the hooves, and a lurch, and they were up on the shrinking island with the calves, in the wind, still a long way from the barn but out of the drowning dark. Cal put the boy inside his own coat, against his own skin, and buttoned it over the both of them. He could feel the small heart going, quick and light, a bird's heart. Still going. He got the calves moving with the flat of his hand and his voice, low and steady, the way his father had taught him to move stock in bad weather, not driving them, calling them, letting the led cow find the high ground and the rest follow her rump through the snow. It took the better part of an hour. The water was at the horse's hocks the whole way, and then it wasn't, and then the black bulk of the barn came up out of the white, and there were lanterns in the yard, and men. And Deane's voice, somewhere in it, angry, because the drifter had gone anyway. Adeline was in the yard. Cal never did learn how she came to be there that night, an hour's ride from town in a killing storm. He would learn later. For now she was just a shape running toward him through the snow with a blanket in her arms, and when he opened his coat and the boy fell out into the lantern light, blue-lipped and breathing, she took him without a word and ran for the house. Cal got down off the horse, and his legs would not hold him. He'd torn his forearm open on the cottonwood snag and never felt it. He sat down hard in the snow of the yard he had been born on, with the 11 hands and the false owner standing around him, and he laughed, once, quiet, because the calves were in and the boy was in, and Hollis Deane's ranch had just been saved by the man Hollis Deane made eat standing up by the door. They carried the boy into the kitchen. Adeline stripped the wet off him and wrapped him in wool and laid him by the stove and rubbed the life back into his feet with her own hands. Somebody put coffee in Cal. Somebody else, old Percy, one of the 2 hands who'd been on the place 20 years, knelt down and rolled Cal's sleeve up off the torn arm to bind it, and stopped. There was the gash from the cottonwood. And above it, old and white and puckered, healed over more than half a lifetime, was a brand. The RANSOME brand, the same iron that was burned into every hide on the range and into the crossbar over the gate, laid once, long ago, into the forearm of a boy of 14 who'd done it on a dare and a dead certainty that he'd own the place someday. Adeline saw it. Cal watched her see it. She had the boy's foot in her 2 hands, and she went still, and her eyes came up to Cal's face and held there, and Cal knew that she knew, and that she had maybe known for a while, since a slate in a trunk with a name scratched in the frame. She didn't say it. Not there, not with the room full of Deane's men. She reached over and pulled his sleeve back down over the brand, gentle, the way she'd handed his hat back at the social, and she went on rubbing the boy's feet. But old Perce had seen it too, and Perce didn't pull any sleeve down. Perce looked at that brand, and then at Cal's face, hard, taking off 4 years and a beard and a lot of hard road, and his mouth came open and no sound came out of it, and then he got up off his knees and walked out into the storm without his coat and stood in the yard by himself for a while. Deane saw all of it. Deane missed nothing, and Cal watched something move behind the foreman's eyes that had not been there before. Not doubt. Deane was past doubt, but calculation. A dead man's trinket was one thing. A dead man's brand, on a living arm. In front of a hand who'd known the sun, that was a fire that needed putting out before it spread. Cal knew then that the waiting was over. One way or another, it would come to a head now, and soon, and he had better have his proof ready when it did. He rode to San Rafael 2 nights later, when he could sit a horse again. The chapel was cold, and the padre was old, and the single candle threw both their shadows huge up the whitewashed wall. Padre Anselmo had known. Since the first night Cal came to him and asked after his mother's papers, in a voice the padre had baptized. He had known, and said nothing, and prayed on it. Now he brought a lamp and led Cal to the back wall, behind the little altar, where a loose adobe brick came out in his 2 hands. Behind it was an oilcloth packet, and in the packet was paper. "Your mother brought it to me the spring before she died," the padre said. "She did not trust it to the house. She said Josiah's honest word ought to live somewhere honest men could find it." He put the packet in Cal's hands. "It names you, Caleb, solely heir. Witnessed by me and by 2 others gone to God now, and sealed. Dated the year you were 16. There is no lawful thing Hollis Deane can hold up against it, save that everyone believes you dead." Cal opened the packet by the lamp. There was the deed, his father's true will, his father's true hand, firm and square, from the years when that hand still worked. There was the wax seal at the foot of it, pressed deep, and Cal took the signet ring out of his saddlebag where it had ridden 4 years wrapped in oilcloth, and he laid the face of the ring against the seal, and the brand in the wax and the brand on the ring were the same brand, cut by the same tool, matched like a key in a lock. 3 things. The brand on his arm, the deed in his father's hand, the ring that made the seal. Any one of them Deane could laugh off. All 3 together, in front of a judge, was a wall no forgery could climb. "There's more," Cal said. "The registry." The padre's face closed. "There is more." He brought the great book down off its shelf and opened it to the leaf Cal had found on his second night, and turned the lamp so the writing showed. And here was the thing Cal had carried alone since that night. The thing that had turned his grief hard as a horseshoe. In the padre's own careful hand, in the mission register, under the winter of that year, that Josiah RANSOME, being brought to the mission gravely stricken in the middle of February, his right side dead, and his right hand paralyzed, unable to sign his own name, had made his marks witnessed. That he had lingered, so that he had died in April. The middle of February. The right hand dead. And Hollis Deane's will was dated the 4th of March, over Josiah RANSOME's bold and flowing signature. A man whose hand had died in February could not sign his name in March. The forgery was not clever. It was only bold, and boldness had always been enough, because who would ever check the date of a dead man's stroke against the date of a dead man's will? Cal would. Cal had. And now it was written in a book kept by a priest, and a priest's book was evidence in any court in the territory. He moved the hearing up, Cal said. Pearce got word into town. Judge Price is riding in. Deane set the sail to the trust for the same afternoon, before first snow, before anybody can raise a question. Then he means to be done and gone before the truth can catch him. Then I'll be in the room. The padre looked at him a long moment. You could take this to the judge quietly, my son. Before, spare yourself the room full of men who spat on you. No, Cal said. It has to be the room. It has to be where they all watched him throw my hat in the mud. A thing done in a corner can be undone in a corner. A thing done in front of the whole town stays done. He wrapped the deed and the registry leaf and the ring back into the oilcloth. Ride in with me, Padre. Bring the book. I need you in the room. The old man crossed himself and reached for his coat. The hearing was held in the long room over the mercantile in Alder Creek. because the town had no court, and half of Alder Creek crowded into it, and the other half stood on the stairs and in the street below and passed word down. Judge Harmon Price sat at a plank table with an inkstand and a Bible and 40 years of circuit riding in his gray face. Hollis Deane sat at the front in a black coat he'd bought for the occasion, with a Denver lawyer beside him and the forged will laid out square on the table under the lawyer's hand. The clerk from the Cattlemen's Trust sat with his sale papers ready and his pen already wet. It was to be quick. It was to be clean. By dark the range would belong to the trust, and Deane would ride to Denver a rich man, and the drifter would be a memory nobody in the room would trouble to keep. Cal stood at the back by the stairs, in his one clean shirt, and they would not let him pass the rail. "A hand's got no standing at a title hearing," the lawyer said, not even bothering to look around at him. "This concerns the estate and the bank and the men of property. You can wait in the street." Deane looked around then. Deane made a point of it. He found Cal's face at the back of the room, and he smiled, slow and easy, a man who had already won and only wanted to enjoy the winning. The judge cleared his throat and took up the will. He read the sense of it aloud in a dry voice, everything of Josiah Ransome's, land and stock and buildings, to his faithful foreman Hollis Deane, there being no living heir. He asked the lawyer to state the date of signing. The lawyer stated it. The 4th of March. And the witnesses to the signing? 2 hands. Since moved on. The lawyer said smoothly. "West, we understand. Common enough on the range. But the document is regular on its face, Your Honor. The signature is the deceased's own, and the estate has stood undisputed near 4 years. We ask the court to confirm title so the sale may proceed. The bank's deadline, you understand, is a matter of days." Judge Price turned the will in the light and looked at the signature a while. It was a good signature. Whoever had done it had a real page of Josiah's to copy, and had copied it well. The judge set it down. Regular on its face, he allowed. "Is there any party present with standing to dispute this will?" And the lawyer said, before anyone could breathe, "There is not, Your Honor," and reached for the trust clerk's pen. That was when Adeline Foss stood up. She had been sitting among the town women in her good dress, with her hands folded, the new schoolteacher, 27 years old and 3 months in the country, and she stood up in that room full of men of property and said, in a voice that shook and did not stop, "I dispute it. I have standing. I have seen the heir." The room turned to her like wheat in wind. The judge's eyebrows went up. Deane laughed, one short bark, before he could catch it. "Miss," the lawyer said, kindly, the way you'd speak to a child, "the RANSOME heir is 4 years dead on a cattle drive in Kansas. The whole county knows it. Grief and books have got tangled in your—" "The whole county knew it," Adeline said, "because Hollis Deane told the whole county so. I am a schoolteacher. I read things carefully. I have read a slate with the name Caleb Ransom scratched into the frame by a boy's hand. I have watched a man gentle a horse no one else on that ranch can touch, and calm a herd in a flood in his father's own words, and I have bound a wound on his arm." Her voice broke and held, "and seen the brand of this ranch healed white into his skin, laid there 20 years ago. A dead man does not carry a brand on his living arm. He is in this room, and you will not put his name to a lie while I have breath to say so." Silence. Then Deane, on his feet, big and easy and dangerous, spreading his hands to the judge, to the room, to the world, Your Honor. "A dead man can't sign a deed. And a spinster schoolmarm sweet on a saddle tramp can't raise the dead to spare his feelings. I've run that range 4 years while she was still back east. Ask any man here who owns, I'll ask him," Cal said, from the back of the room. He said it quiet. He always said things quiet. But the room had gone so still that quiet carried to the stairs and down them into the street, and the whole of Alder Creek heard the saddle tramp speak, and turned to see. Cal came up the center of the room. Nobody stopped him this time. The lawyer put out a hand at the rail and then took it back. Cal walked to the plank table and stood in front of Judge Harmon Price, and he rolled up his right sleeve, slow, so every soul in the room could watch it happen, and he laid his bare forearm on the table under the judge's lamp. The brand. White and old and unmistakable, the same iron that hung by the ranch forge. The same mark burned into every steer that had walked out that gate for 40 years. I took that at 14, Cal said. On a dare. My father tanned me for it, and then he cried, because he said it meant I'd never be free of this place, and he was right. My name is Caleb Ransom. Josiah was my father. I did not die in Kansas. I came home 8 weeks ago and hired on to my own ranch under a false name for $1 a day, and I ate standing by the door, and I slept in the tack room, because I wanted to see what a man does with another man's land when he thinks the owner's son is bones in a Kansas ditch. And now I know. Nobody moved. Then, from the corner where the town's dogs had drowsed through the proceedings, the old Blue healer got up. Blue was near blind and stiff in the hips, and hadn't crossed a room faster than a walk in 3 years. He crossed that one. He came straight down the center of the floor to Cal, and put his gray muzzle against Cal's knee, and leaned his whole old weight into the man's leg, and would not be moved, and a sound went through the room. A low sound. Because everyone in Alder Creek knew that dog had loved exactly one man in his life, and that man had been dead 4 years. Old Perce stood up. "That's him," Percy said, and his voice cracked all to pieces. "God help me, I've been afraid to say it a week. That's Caleb. I taught him to rope. That's Josiah's boy." The second old hand stood up beside him without a word and took off his hat and held it, the way you hold your hat at a graveside or at a homecoming, and the two of them stood there, bareheaded. And that was worth more to that room than any lawyer's paper, because the whole town knew those two men had ridden for the RANSOMEs 20 years and would not stand and bare their heads for a lie. Deane's face had begun to come apart. Not much. A tightness at the jaw. A whiteness. "It's a trick," he said, and the ease was gone out of his voice now. There was a scrape in it. A scar and a fool dog. Any drover carries scars. He heard the name, he learned the trade off some old hand. "He's playing you all for Padre Anselmo," Cal said. "Come up, if you would." The old priest came up the center of the room with the great registry book held against his chest in both arms like a child, and the mission's true deed folded on top of it, and he laid them on the plank table in front of Judge Price. And he said, in English gone soft at the edges from 50 years of Spanish, "I baptized this man. I buried his mother. I witnessed his father's true will with my own hand and sealed it in my own chapel wall where it has lain these 18 years. He opened the deed and turned it for the judge. Josiah Ransome, of sound mind and working hand, leaves all he has to his elder son, Caleb. Read the date, Your Honor. Read it aloud. Judge Price read the deed. He read it in full and slow, and the room drank every word of it, and when he came to the seal at the foot he stopped and looked close at it through his spectacles. Cal reached into his shirt and drew out the signet ring on its cord, and slipped it off and set it face down in the melted tallow that had run from the lamp onto the table, and pressed it, and lifted it, and the brand it left in the tallow matched the brand in the wax at the foot of the deed exactly, curve for curve, nick for nick, the same tool, the same hand, across 18 years. 3 ways, Your Honor, Cal said. The brand on my arm, my father's deed in my father's hand, and the seal that only this ring can make. I'd have shown you any 2 and let you doubt me. I'm showing you 3 so you can't. The judge set the ring beside the seal and looked from one to the other for a long time. Then he took up the registry book that Padre Anselmo had opened for him, and he read the winter entry, the one about the middle of February, the stroke, the dead right hand, the marks made because the man could no longer sign his name. And then he took up Hollis Deane's will, dated the 4th of March, and laid it beside the registry, and he looked at the two dates together, and the whole room watched him do it, and watched him understand. "Mr. Deane," Judge Price said. He said it very mildly. That was the terrible part, how mild it was. This registry, kept by a mission and admissible in any court I've sat, records that Josiah Ransome's right hand was paralyzed by a stroke in the middle of February of that year, and that he could not thereafter sign his name. Your will bears his signature, and the date the 4th of March. He set the papers down and folded his hands on top of them. Perhaps you would care to explain to this court how a man with a dead hand signed his name a full 2 weeks after it died. The room had been silent. Now, it got quieter than silent. Cal had heard silence like it exactly once before, out in the flood, in the half-second after the boy's grip failed, and before Cal's hand closed on his collar. A held breath before the fall. Deane did not explain. There was no explaining it. Cal watched him try, watched the mouth work, watched the Denver lawyer very quietly slide his own chair back 6 inches from the table to put daylight between himself and the will he had laid out so square, and that 6 inches was the sound of Hollis Deane's world ending. Because when your own hired lawyer moves away from you in front of a judge, you are already alone. "I ran that ranch," Deane said. "It came out low. 4 years. I kept it off the rocks after the old man died. I made it pay." Where was he? He flung an arm at Cal without looking at him. 4 years, drifting, sulking, letting everyone think him dead. Where was he when the notes came due and the winters came? "I earned that land." "You forged a dead man's name to steal it," the judge said, "and you buried a living man under a false grave to keep it, and you were an hour from selling it out from under 11 working men to line your own pockets in Denver. You didn't earn a ranch, Mr. Deane. You earned an indictment." He turned his head. Constable. There was a constable, a big, slow, deliberate man named Halloran, and he had been standing at the side of the room the whole time with his thumbs in his belt, and he came forward now. And here was the thing Cal would remember longest, longer than the flood, longer than the brand, longer than the ring in the wax. It was not the constable. It was Deane's own men. There were 11 hands off the RANSOME place packed into that room. Men who'd taken Deane's orders and Deane's pay and laughed at Deane's jokes about the drifter for 8 weeks. And as Halloran came forward, those men, one by one, stepped back. Not toward Deane, away from him. They stepped back and made a space around Hollis Deane in the middle of that crowded room. A clear circle of floor with the foreman alone in the center of it, the way stock will cut one steer out of the bunch and leave it standing by itself in the open, and it was the loneliest thing Cal ever saw a room do to a man. Deane looked around at their backs and their turned shoulders, and he understood, finally, the thing his blind spot had never let him see. That the poor do not stay silent forever, and the dead do not always stay dead, and a man who rules only by being feared owns nothing at all the moment the fear runs out. Halloran took his arm. At the door, Deane stopped and looked back, and found Cal's face one last time, and there was no more ease in him and no more calculation, just the flat spite of a beaten man. And he said, "Dry. Through his teeth, should have buried you deeper." Cal did not answer him. That was the whole of it. Cal stood there and looked back at him and said not one word, and let the silence be the answer, and the silence crushed Hollis Deane flatter than any words in the language could have, because a man that size, in that black coat he'd bought to be a landowner in, wants to be cursed at, wants a fight, wants to matter enough to be shouted at on his way out the door. Cal gave him nothing. Cal gave him the same nothing Deane had given the drifter by the door all those weeks, the exact weight of it handed back, and Halloran walked him down the stairs and out through the town he'd lorded over and into the cold, and the room let out its breath. The judge was not quite finished. He had the trust clerk brought forward, the young man who'd sat all afternoon with his sale papers and his wet pen, and the young man came white and stammering. Padre Anselmo's registry did one more piece of work that afternoon, because the padre, being an honest man who kept honest books, had also kept the mission's account of the monies Josiah had lodged with the chapel for safekeeping across the years. And Cal and the padre together had spent 3 nights laying the mission's numbers against what little of the ranch's books Percy could smuggle out to them, and the numbers told a plain story. Hollis Deane had not been keeping the ranch off the rocks. He had been bleeding it. The $4,200 the Cattlemen's Trust said was owed had been paid down near to nothing by the ranch's own beef over 4 years, and Deane had pocketed the payments and let the paper stand, so that the debt would look alive and the sale would look forced, and honest men would nod and let the range go. Judge Price laid it out for the clerk in that same mild voice, and the young man's pen hand shook, and the judge told him the trust could either sort out its own books before he sorted them for it in open court, or it could sign the RANSOME place clear that very afternoon on the strength of payments it had already banked and never credited. The clerk chose the pen. Of course, he chose the pen. Cal watched the young man sign the ranch clear of the Cattlemen's Trust of Denver an hour before first snow, on the same plank table where, 40 minutes earlier, that same clerk had meant to sign it away, and it was done, and the ranch that had said ransom over its gate for 40 years belonged to a ransom again, free and clear, before the light failed. The town went down the stairs slowly, the way people leave a church. A good many of them stopped and put a hand out to Cal, men who'd watched Deane throw his hat in the mud at the social and had not moved from their chairs, and Cal took every hand they offered because his mother had raised him to, and because a man who wants his own name back has no business refusing other men theirs. But he watched who came first and who came late. And he did not forget, and neither did the town, which is its own kind of justice and slower than a judge's. Percy came last, hat still in his hands. "I knew," the old man said. "Week ago, in the yard, when your arm come out from under that sleeve. I knew, and I was a coward, and I never said. He'd have run me off. I'm too old to start over, and I let that keep my mouth shut while they made a fool of Josiah's boy." He couldn't look up. "I'm ashamed, Caleb. You stood up today," Cal said. "You stood up first, before the priest, before the papers, when it could still have cost you. That's the standing up that counts, Perce. The rest is just being afraid. And every man in this room was afraid of that money and that black coat. You got over it. Come home and run my horse string like you ran my father's, and we'll call the account square." The old man's face worked, and he put his hat on so he'd have something to do with his hands, and he went down the stairs. Adeline was waiting at the foot of them. They walked out into the street together, and it had begun, at last, the first snow, coming down soft and straight in the last of the light, the snow the whole hard autumn had been racing, and it fell on the two of them, and on the town, and on the mule that had come in riderless a week before, and was now hitched fat and warm outside the mercantile, its boy asleep somewhere safe. "I owe you an apology," Adeline said. She was looking at the snow, not at him. "I pitied you. I stood on Mrs. Pell's porch that first week and I thought, there's a decent broke drifter, and I slipped you half my supper the way you'd leave a saucer of milk out. I read Latin and Greek, and I could not read the man in front of me, and I am more ashamed of that than of any wrong thing I ever did on purpose, because it was lazy, and a teacher has no business being lazy about a person." Now she looked at him. "I owe an apology to a man I mistook for a lesser one." "You handed me my hat back," Cal said. "That was at the social. When he threw it in the mud and the whole town watched, and not one soul moved. You crossed that floor and picked it up and cleaned it and handed it back to me clean. You didn't know my name then. You didn't know there was a deed or a ring or a ranch. You thought I was exactly the broke drifter you're standing here apologizing for, and you crossed the room anyway." He shook his head slow. "Adeline, you don't owe that man an apology. That man got the only thing in 8 weeks that told him he was still a man and not a dog. You chose me when I was nothing. There's no pity in the world worth as much as that, and no apology owed for it. It's the other way around." She was quiet a while, and the snow came down. "The only name I ever wanted back," Cal said, "was the one burned over that gate. I've had a lot of nights to think about what I wanted. Sleeping in that tack room, and it always came down to just that. My name back over my father's gate. Honest, the way he'd have wanted it." He turned his hat in his hands, the same hat. But somewhere in the last 8 weeks, it stopped being enough. I got greedy. I want the name over the gate. And I want yours beside it. If you'd have a rancher who slept in his own tack room and ate standing up and let a whole town believe him dead, I'd count that a better fortune than the land. The snow gathered in her hair and on her shoulders, and she let it, and she looked up at him, the schoolteacher, who read everything carefully, and she read him right this time, and what she said was, "Yes." Just that. She'd have said more. She was a woman of many careful words, but that was the only one the moment needed, and she was too good a teacher to spend a word she didn't need. Spring came late that year, the way it does at that altitude, but it came. The gate got repainted the first warm week. Perce and the 2 aging hands did it, and the boy Toms did the lettering with a brush too big for his fist and his tongue between his teeth, and Ransom came up fresh and black over the crossbar, straighter than it had been in years. Toms was the youngest hand on the place now, 9 years old, and worth his keep and then some, sleeping in the bunkhouse with the men who'd finally earned a bunkhouse worth sleeping in, riding a fat pony Cal had bought him, carrying always in his shirt pocket a little carved pine horse that a drifter had whittled him behind the mercantile one hard afternoon before either of them knew who the drifter was. His father drove down from town on Sundays to see how the boy was coming, and the boy was coming fine. The schoolhouse was full. Adeline Ransom kept it. She would not give it up, ranch or no ranch, and Cal would not have asked her to, and the children of Alder Creek learned their letters from a woman who had once stood up in a room full of men of property and disputed a forged will with nothing behind her but a slate and the truth. The old blue healer had given up on the town at last and moved out to the ranch for good, and he spent his last good spring on the porch in the sun where he could see the gate, and he saw everyone who came and went, and he only ever got up for one man. Padre Anselmo came to supper the first Sunday after the branding was done, and blessed the table and the herd and the marriage, and he brought Cal his mother's oilcloth packet to keep now that it had done its work. And Cal put it in a box with the deed, where a man keeps the papers that say who he is. And Cal wore the signet ring, at last, on his own hand, the heavy silver with the brand cut into the face of it. He'd carried it 4 years wrapped in oilcloth in a saddlebag, and never once put it on. Because a man on the drift, with a rich man's ring, gets his throat cut for it, and because, if he was honest, he hadn't felt he'd earned the right to wear his father's mark while he was running from his father's land. He'd earned it now. He wore it every day, and it caught the light when he worked, and the men saw it and thought nothing of it, because it belonged there now, the way a thing does once it's back where it started. One dry beat closed it, late in that first spring. A letter came up from the territory, from the prison down south where they'd sent Hollis Deane to serve out his years for forgery and fraud against the estate and the bank. Cal never learned what was in it, whether it was spite or a plea or a threat or a beggar's apology, because he did not open it. He looked at the hand it was addressed in, that same bold, flowing hand that had once forged a dead man's name so well it fooled a whole county, and he turned the envelope over, and he wrote across the back of it, unopened, in his own square hand that was so much like his father's, "Return to sender." And he gave it back to the rider to carry down the mountain, and he never spoke of it again. And that was the last the ranch ever heard of the man who'd made its rightful owner eat, standing up by the door. A name isn't a thing you burn into a board over a gate. Cal had thought it was, for a long time, thought if he could just get the letters back up there, painted fresh, everything would be square. But the letters were only ever the smallest part of it. A name is the thing a dog remembers when 4 years have taken your face, It's what two old men will stand up bareheaded and swear to when swearing to it might cost them their place. It's the way a woman crosses a crowded floor to hand a stranger back his hat when she thinks he's nobody at all. Most of all, it's the thing you carry and how you work, and how you treat the small and the cold and the drowning, when nobody knows who you are and nobody's keeping score, because that, in the end, is the only place a name is really kept. Cal RANSOME had gone all the way to the bottom and worked like an honest man when he was nothing to anybody, and the name had been waiting for him the whole time. Over the gate and in the wax, and healed white into his own arm, right where he'd left it. If this story stayed with you, comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far this ride has traveled.